Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. This session is deliberately designed accessibility and current trend in UX UI. And during this session, we will discuss what are the best practices for UX UI and accessibility, and where in the product building process does the user design comes into focus, and at last, when should you hire the first product designer? And to get started, let's go around and do a round of introduction for everybody in this panel. And I will start with myself. I'm a UX UI designer at Stanford University, and I start off my design career right after my master's degree in information experience design. And I'm currently working on a project that helps biomedical researchers collect the research data and an education platform that teaches high school students how to process and analyze health data. And we'll hand it off to Tamar.
Awesome. Really nice to meet you. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. My name is Tamar, and I'm an facility operations lead at Verily. Verily is an alphabet company focused on very ambitious goal of changing the way healthcare is currently delivered. I've been working in the accessibility space for some time now. I worked at VMware before I joined Verily and LinkedIn for a few years, and then joined Verily 5 months ago to start their product accessibility program. In my current role, I work closely with designers and developers and content creators on how to make sure that our product are inclusive and accessible so they can be really used by everyone. And then I'll pass it on to someone on the panel. There is Henry there. Pass it on to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Henry. I am a senior product design manager at HubSpot. We are a software company based out of Cambridge, Mass. For CRM, sales, service software, marketing software. I currently am a senior product design manager for our UX team. Our UX team right now is about 270 people, which includes UX leads, researchers, content designers, and product designers. I specifically lead our fintech function, where we actually own all of the buying and subscription management software, where we transact over $1.6 billion last year. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Lynn. I am a designer and self-proclaimed computational artist living in Boston. My background is in economics and visual design, and I've been working in the tech industry for over 7 years now, across places that develop technologies on voice assistant, travel, and now robotics. So currently, I'm a lead product designer at Motional. And at Motional, we develop self-driving cars, and my main focus is on the rider and the road user experience. And as someone who don't drive myself, I have a vested interest in this product. And being a woman in tech, as well as an immigrant in tech, I'm also very passionate about designing for inclusivity and accessibility. And that's why I'm here today, and super excited to hear about all the stories around designing for accessibility. And with that, I pass on to Yash.
Thank you. My name is Yash. I started a couple tech-enabled marketing agencies over the years. I've been an entrepreneur for the past, a full-time entrepreneur for the past 8-9 years. And both those agencies, Next Wave Hire, Internet Caddy, are tech-enabled marketing agencies. And then I'm also a product advisor at Tire Tutor. So in my role, I'm more on the product and engineering side. I'm an engineer by background. And really over the years, what I've come to really appreciate is how simple UX and UI actually is very complicated under the surface. And so I'm excited to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Let's dive into, it's a little bit weird because I see like everyone on the stage is looking back. But yeah, let's dive into our first question. To get this started, let's establish how do you define user experience?
I can kick us off. So I define user experience as everything the customer interacts with. That is everything before they're even a customer, to the customer lifecycle, to even when they're finished being one of your customers. I think user experience in terms of the practice itself is really about problem solving. So if you are a UX designer, product designer, there's a lot of names out there, a lot of different titles. You are at the end of the day of a problem solver. So you try to identify what the problem is, and you basically use the practice of user experience and design to solve that problem.
To add on from the accessibility standpoint, so what is the user experience? How a person, a users feel about or interact with or experiencing a specific product, right? And for a user experience, you want a good user experience, you probably have 4 characteristics. One is it usable? It means that the design and the structure and the purpose of the product is really clear and easy to use. Second thing is equitable. So product design need to address the needs of a diverse audience to ensure this really high quality experience is delivered to all of our users, regardless of their background or gender or race or abilities. The third is that it needs to be enjoyable, and we talk a lot about it as a design, right? It means that the design needs to delight the users. And then the end is the fourth one is that it's useful, right? So it needs to solve, to kind of some kind of a problem, an issue that the user might have. So this is for me, a user experience.
Thank you, Tamar. Yeah, I think this is a good summary for, I think, mainly problems solving, be able to solve problem and also be able to create a product that's solving problem for a diverse audience. And let's move on to our next question is, what do we mean by product accessibility and how do we do it right?
I can kick us off on this question. So I think that it's important to kind of like have a shared understanding of what we mean by accessibilities. When people talk about like disabilities, often people would think of it as something that is permanent or people are born with, but that is untrue. Because everyone, like will potentially experience a temporary or situational disability in their lifetime, everybody. So when we say that we are designing for, say, like someone who is a paraplegic, we're also designing and supporting the needs of someone, the temporary needs of someone who potentially have an arm injury, or situational needs of like maybe like say a new parent who have a child on one arm and can only use the other arm. So in a sense, like when we're talking about product designing for product accessibility, we are really benefiting everybody and we're thinking about everyone's need at some point in their lives.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And actually, I kind of look at it one maybe level up from that or a higher level from that, where really, your product, when your users interact with your product, they have a specific goal in mind. And designing for usability and accessibility is allowing as many of those users as you can, being inclusive to that point, to achieve that goal in a simple, seamless, and painless process. So that could mean, helping people who do have special needs use your product, but it also generally means helping anyone navigate your product, even if they're not familiar with it, getting started, or a seasoned power user of your product.
Yeah, thank you. So how would you, what are some of the challenges you face in terms of building accessibility features in your work?
I can kick us off on that one. I think I'll speak from the perspective of an early stage startup founder. When you start out, you have, a handful of customers, and you're spending so much time with each of these customers, really trying to understand how are they using your product, what are their goals, and it's really easy actually to take any one of those voices or pieces of feedback as the universal truth. And I think when designing for general usability and accessibility, it's really important to start to try and decipher between what are some of the idiosyncrasies of the early users that are using your product and what are some of the more universal customer behaviors. And I think that's actually one of the hardest challenges of an early stage startup, because you can really pivot back and forth if you're not careful that way. And so I think getting to that universal truth is probably one of the bigger challenges.
So I joined HubSpot when we were a team of 13 people, 13 total UX people. Now we're actually a team of 270. So I would say that during my last 6.5 years at HubSpot, we're obviously no longer a startup anymore. The biggest challenges that I've seen is scale. Is like, how do we do accessibility consistently across all of the different products, especially as we start to build additional products every single year and launch them. So I think there's a couple different ways to do this. I think at the upper level, or what I call the federal level, you can actually have federal level guidance to basically componentize a lot of your elements to create that consistency. So you're basically solving for accessibility at the global layer. And then when it comes to the product level, which is the state level, I guess, federal and state, at the state level, you can actually create guidance for your and usability testing for your individual products to basically fix accessibility over time. So I think there's a scalability issue. And I think one of the other common issues that you find with accessibility also is advocacy. I think especially in startups, I think often the goal is, the road to profitability, the road to making sure that you can get another round of funding. And I think a lot of times the shiny object that allows you to basically get to that next level is like, hey, what is a new feature I'm building? How am I acquiring more customers? How am I monetizing more customers? How am I getting my customers to retain with me and pay me more on a monthly basis? And I think that sometimes can shove accessibility aside. And I think one of the things that we can actually do for the industry is actually speak to the value of accessibility. I think some of my other colleagues here spoke to it already, which is, the more you can actually increase the access of your features and functionality to more users, the larger your customer pool is, right? So I just want to make sure that people are thinking about how to actually tie accessibility back to that business value piece. So that way you can be an advocate for it and really push accessibility to the forefront.
I actually really want to kind of like double tap on this because I think this is really important, especially for startup, right? So for any company that wants to ever sell to federal entities, so like a company that takes money from federal, which could be hospitals, universities, kind of like you name it, they need to comply with laws. And these laws mean that you need to meet specific standards in order for them to be able to bid. Without you meeting those minimum criteria, which is called WCAG 2.1 level AA, you're not going to be able to even sell for those institutions. So again, accessibility as a sales opportunity for that market, one thing. Second thing is, like Henry was saying, when you create products that are accessible, they are accessible for everyone. So you might be targeting at first kind of like the 1.3 billion people with disabilities, 1.3 billion. It's a lot of people of that untapped talent. However, once you create products that are accessible for that group, you're actually scaling this impact. And a good example for that would be, for example, closed captioning. Closed captioning was originally created for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. But now if I am, English is not my first language, or if I'm in a very loud airport and can't see the video, I'm probably going to turn on captions and then can be used by everyone. And so going back to the point that this is your sales opportunities, this is your market opportunity, is really important. The other issue that I'm seeing a lot with startup, and I just got back from Israel, there's a lot of startup there, and what they're starting to realize is that accessibility usually is thought as an afterthought, kind of like this add-on where you need to tackle it only at the QA level. When you do that, the issue is it costs a lot of money, right? Because you already designed, you already developed, you already built, especially if it's a hardware or software, it's going to take you a lot of money and resources to fix it. However, integrating accessibility right from the start, meaning doing research with accessibility, integrated into the design process, has zero, it's part of the way that you do things, and it's not going to cost a lot. So there's this kind of like, stigma around accessibility being really expensive. It is expensive if you do it later. But the fact is that you can integrate it from the start. If you do that, this is how you build innovation. This is how you build this like really amazing creative product that can be used by everyone.
It's also really expensive if you don't do it either, because the fines for not having accessibility is also quite high. Something to think about.
Yeah, so if it's for someone who is just starting to learn about accessibility, what are the key things they should consider, say, like when they build a product?
I think as a designer, I can give this as advice for any like designers out there who might want think about like looking more into accessibilities. So I think one of the most powerful tools for designers is actually to just observe and to really listen. So there are a lot of like great established design guidelines out there for accessibilities, and they're super valuable as a foundation. But there's still a lot of knowledge gaps, especially if you're designing for or like developing a novel product. So say I would give an example. So at Motional, we're trying to design for like people who are blind or low vision. And like one of the things a lot of products or car companies would do is that they would add Braille to meet ADA requirements, and they will code that as something that is, like accessible for blind users. But as we talk to the National Federation of the Blind, we learned that actually only 1 out of 10 blind people actually can read Braille. So in a sense, like in that case, even if you add Braille, it doesn't actually make it accessible for blind people. And like all of this, like once we talk to the community, work directly with the impacted community and population, you can actually understand more of the nuances and the difference in their experience, and that will make you a better designer, and that will also help build a product that can potentially fit in people's lifestyle and habits.
To the point of designing for accessibility early on, and it being less expensive if you start early on to design that, I totally agree. As a product, in its earliest stages, there are a ton of tools out there. Even if you don't have a dedicated team that can focus on this, there's some Chrome extensions that I've used in the past that follow the WCAG 2.1 guideline that can check your web app. And this is from a software perspective, so it might be different when you're talking about hardware, obviously. But from the software perspective, if it's a web application, website, there are very sort of off-the-shelf ways to actually build around accessibility as well. And if you would like to know more of those tools, I'm happy to dive into that, later in question and answer.
And kind of like just to add on that, I think that going back to the fact that designers have a lot, I don't know how many designers are in the room, but designers actually have a lot of responsibility when it comes to accessibility. Actually, there was a really good research that showed that 67% of accessibility issues can be prevented if they're detected earlier on, right? And from a design standpoint, accessibility is not only how things look. A lot of kind of like the challenges we're seeing is that translation between my mocks, my design, to the language that the developer is creating. So, if you're a designer, you have a lot of responsibility, not only from that visual standpoint, but also from that annotation and making sure that these are clear. And so, if you're a designer, I highly encourage you to even think about it this way in terms of how are we translating everything that we've designed to the developer so they can code things correctly on their end. So what is the right user flow? Where is the right kind of like the keyboard navigation, the focus, the right flow of the focus navigation? So it's not only that visual, it's also all the annotations that we're doing around. As other colleagues said, there's tons of tools that you can use, some of them automated, so you can automate wherever you can automate. So color testing, for example. I don't know why if there was a research about like the most common accessibility issues, and color contrast was one of them, which I don't really understand, because this is something they can 100% automate. So things that you can automate them, or things without alternative text. So image without alternative text. Again, all images should have an alternative text so they can be read by a screen reader, for example. Again, some of the things that can be automated, make sure that you're automating is part of the design kind of process, and then also making sure that how you transition things for developers as well. That language, HTML, is important.
This is super good advice, because I feel like as a designer, we're in the school, we don't really get educated enough on accessibility. So I feel like it's almost like part of it's almost part of our job. Like we could explore those tools and then dive a little bit more deep into those topics, and even like find mentors to give us more feedback on those topics as well. And so I think everyone has touched that on the next topic a little bit about the design process. So Tamara has mentioned earlier about collaborating, like making annotations on the design, and then how to collaborate with an engineering team. So what does everyone else think about, do you think collaborating with do you think the engineering team need to understand the user needs?
So I think everyone needs to understand user needs for what it's worth. Everyone needs to be part of those UX research sessions, sitting in some of those sessions, understanding what the highlights are, understanding where the user pain is, where the struggles are. I think it just creates easier team alignment. So our CEO, Yamini, she actually said alignment is actually more important than strategy, because you can have the best strategy in the world, but if people are not aligned on it and bought in, then you can't really execute. So at a high level, I would say definitely have your engineers in the loop in terms of all the things you're doing with UX.
Yeah, I also think that having engineers, I'm an engineer by background, it's really easy for engineers, especially myself, to get carried away and want to build the most technically complex thing, or, lose sight of, the user's goals. And I think actually what I've seen is when there's a better line of communication between product, sales, marketing, customer success, and engineering, you're going to shorten the development cycle quite a bit, because no matter how meticulously you write a product specification or a set of requirements, there are always going to be gaps or holes in those requirements. And a lot of times, engineers need to fill in those gaps as they kind of build towards that set of requirements. And having some knowledge about the user's needs and the goals allow them to make more successful, educated guesses that dramatically shorten the development cycle.
Yeah, I completely agree on that. And I think that whenever we talk in a company, we always talk about having empathy for our users, but it's also important to have empathy for your own team as well. And I think a lot of the time when the engineers team push back on certain features, it usually was a result of, like, for example, say out of the blue request without any background or understanding of the why we're building something. So definitely agree with both of the panelists here that, like, we should try to bring engineers in as early as possible in the process. And as we develop our design, let's show it to them, ask them how they think, and potentially maybe they don't agree with one of the ideas, but there might be new ideas coming up on that.
So I think Linh might already have touched on this, but I was wondering, is there any effective ways to communicate with the engineering team? Say, like, how would you usually go with this kind of discussion? Because they, they might have their priorities, but on your end, how do you sort of start that conversation?
I think teams are most effective. And when I say effective, I mean teams can ship things quickly, well, to customers when there is alignment between all three functions, right? So there is alignment in terms of what is technically feasible. There is alignment in terms of what value this is providing to the business. And there is alignment on what value this is providing to the customer. So I think in order for you to do that, I think by the time you're treating the communication medium or the communication style, I think by that point, you're actually addressing a symptom. I think what you need to do is actually fix this earlier in the culture, which is like, how do you actually build in that engineering, that product, that designer collaboration early on? So that way everyone's in loop and in sync at the same time. And when I hire designers, I basically say, hey, listen, when you join the team, you only own 51% of UX, right? And 51% only because of accountability, because at the end of the day, you have to make that call and that decision. But everybody else in your team, in terms of the product managers and the engineers, I expect them also to have a perspective around what the user experience should be. So I think by building that culture, you actually solve for the how do I communicate with my engineering conversation much later on, because now you're moving as a unit versus doing everything within a silo and having these really, really tough handoffs to actually have those conversations.
Yeah, that's a great point. I wonder what you all think about, should this kind of change of culture coming from the top to bottom, or is it in a smaller organization, like a startup environment, maybe less than 50 people? Is it coming from bottom up? Is it from the designer, starting from the designer? And I'm also curious about everyone, because everyone works in different, the size of the team is different. So I was wondering, is there any difference in terms of, if you're working for a larger team, is this kind of change usually come from top down, or is it bottom up?
I don't want to hog the microphone, so I'm going to let someone else speak first.
Yeah, I can start on this question. So I think that it has to be both, of course. As Henry said, it should be something that is company-wide from top down, but there's also a benefit in like having it bottom up in terms of like who you hire in your company. Like what is there like representation of like, you know, people with diverse background? Is there representation of people with, you know, in the disabilities community? So I remember like in my first job in Intrepid, one of my mentors, he's an amazing designer, but he is also colorblind. And at the time, I didn't even think that you could be a designer with color blindness. And he has taught me so much about, you know, designing with color blindness in mind. And that was also kind of like the start of my interest in looking at inclusive design, accessibility. So having someone in the team, you know, who have like firsthand experience, advocate for it, help everyone else empathize a little bit more with like why we need to design for inclusivity and accessibility as well.
And I
Yeah,
think
that's-
that to add, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think just to add to this, because I think it's such an important note where when we're thinking about accessibility and inclusive, we need to remember that we cannot create products for. We need to make sure that we're creating it with, which means that in order for us to really create those accessible, inclusive products, we need to embed accessibility and inclusion into the fabric of your organization. And that means hiring people from that diverse background who will be able to be there and provide you this kind of like ongoing feedback, to provide this kind of like ideas from different directions, and just be that kind of like, we all have blind spots, right? So what are the areas that we can really be open to it? So in the disability community, there's something that says like nothing about us without us. And it's really about that, right? So it's not for, it's with. And in order for us to really do this, it's not done when you're working on the product if your website is not accessible. It's not done if your product is accessible, but your hiring process is not inclusive. So there's something that needs to be from the up down from the organization, that leadership commitment to really include everyone, but kind of like from down as well. And what you'll find is that in a lot of organizations, you'll find people, even if you're a startup of like 5-10 people are passionate about it. Use them. It doesn't cost anything. Like a lot of that movements from an organization, whether I worked in like this really big organization or a small one, were from those advocates. Give them the tools that they need to help you scale this. They're going to help you move it forward. They'll be happy to do it. So use that force, kind of like it has to be from that, you know, up, down, and bottom up approach.
And to piggyback off of that, that's a great answer. I think a diversity in opinion from your customer base as well and your user group is really helpful. Building like a customer advisory board, especially in the earliest days of your company, is super invaluable. And choosing people who are not only, you know, invested in the growth and success of your company, but also have to the point of hiring a diverse background. If you're an early stage startup and you don't necessarily have the resources to hire a big team at, you know, right at the outset, you can find a diverse group of your customer base and tap, you know, their feedback and knowledge and to build an inclusive product.
The last thing I'll say, and to add to that, is that in terms of the top-down or bottom-up question, it has to be both. And I'm assuming that inside of this session, we have a lot of startup founders. So as leaders of your organization, that's coming from top-down. I think what you can do best in terms of facilitating a great culture is actually add principles and guidance, right? So principles being like, we are a diverse, inclusive company. We have psychological safety where people can ask whatever question they want, provide whatever opinion or feedback they want. And that's how you basically create that culture from the top down. And then from the bottom up, you have to listen to everyone on the team, right? So you have to treat culture almost like it's a product of its own. Who are the users? What problems is it solving for? What feedback do they have for you? How do you update on your culture operating system over time so you can continue to iterate on it over time to make it better for your employees? So I would say it's a combination of top down and bottom up.
Great answers. Thank you, everyone. And if you were to hiring a product designer, when would you advise the team to say like hire their first product designer or UX designer?
I can kick that off. I actually, to date, have always hired freelance contract designers, but always hired them pretty early on in the process, because I think it's important to get a professional, you know, to advise you on the best ways to build this idea that's in your head and put it, down into a tangible product. So to date, I haven't hired someone full time on my team who's, an in-house designer, but I think there are a lot of great freelance and contract designers out there that do great work.
I would say the answer is it depends. If you are a startup, you are probably trying to find people that could wear a lot of different hats, right? So you're probably trying to find that one designer that could do design and research, maybe a little bit of coding. My personal opinion is that I actually think having a designer that can actually do a little bit more product management is actually extremely valuable for startups. So I would say it depends. When you're scaling up, I would say that you try to generally hire about 3 months in advance if you could. And then when you're at the size that HubSpot is at, you want to hire your designer 6 months ago. So we're a little late on everything these days.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that too, a lot of the time, when in the earlier phase that startup, because people are looking for generalist designer, or we normally call unicorn designers. A lot of the time, they're I guess like the design education hasn't been used to also have accessibility as part of that generalist toolkit. So a lot of company only hire specialists or accessibility experts when they've already grown, the team is bigger, and they focus on improving their products. And is it too late to bring in accessibility experts at that time? Maybe, probably, better late than never. But I would also suggest that, for any generalist designers out there, maybe consider adding, knowledge of accessibility as part of your toolkit as well. So it would it would help the company, and it would also help you to be a better designer.
Something that came to mind, sorry, as you were speaking, is one of the trends that I'm seeing in the industry right now, especially with startups, is that a lot of venture capitalists are actually starting to hire their own in-house team of UXers, and they basically sent out to a lot of their startups to advise. And I think what this trend is telling me is that these days, the differentiation in your product really comes down to the usability of your product and how easy customers can access and also start to use your product right away so they can start to generate value. So I think it's actually a really great trend. And I think if this trend continues, this speaks to how I think UX is starting to become more valuable in the startup industry, so that your first hire is not always just an engineer and just a product manager, but designers as well too, especially as you start to have designers that are a little bit more generalists that could do a little bit of everything.
I think Yash speak about finding you have been always hiring freelance designers. And do you have any suggestions for where do you find good quality product designers, freelance designers?
That is a very good question. I've tried the marketplaces, and that is hit or miss, like Upwork, or those are hit or miss. To be honest with you, there are a lot of good designers at companies who have full-time jobs, who are more than happy to take on freelance work, and they come with networks of other people who they would recommend if they don't have the bandwidth to take on that project. So, to be honest with you, I've done cold outreach to designers at companies like HubSpot, and hired people on a freelance basis like that.
That's awesome. And I think as an employer, as someone who's hiring a product designer, what are some of the qualities, or culture or vibe, you want to cultivate to attract designers that could contribute valuable work? So how would you present yourself? Are there any tips?
This is a tough one because we actually have a really strong evaluation guide at HubSpot, and this evaluation guide is pages long, and it actually includes a lot of different attributes of someone that we would hire. So I'm trying to find a way to summarize it, but I think I just want to be really careful in terms of saying hey, how is this person a culture fit? Because there's actually a lot of biases there that you can sometimes go unchecked. A lot of unconscious bias is kind of hey, does this person look like me? Did they go to the same school I did? Do they live in the same area that I do? So that's really, really tough. I think the thing that I try to always anchor back down to is some sort of evaluation guide, and actually strongly recommend for a lot of people as you start to scale your UX team to actually come together with a guide in terms of what competencies you're looking for and what does good sound like for those competencies, or what does it look like, and what are some of the signals where you might turn someone down. I want to go a little deeper into this, but I'm happy to probably do this at a separate time, because we could talk for a very long time around this subject. So I can share my contact afterwards, and if anybody wants to reach out and learn a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you. And I think in terms of as a designer, say like if you're looking for being hired by a company, what are some of the red flags you might want to pay attention to when you choose early stage company to work with?
I'm not a designer, but I know I get asked the question from people that we potentially hire on a freelance basis, you know, just making sure we have the runway to support their work. And of course we do when we hire them. That obviously that would, for an early stage company, that would be one of the biggest red flags. I think ultimately the designer also has to have some sort of, you know, ideas that they bring to the table. And if they're not able to generate those ideas or don't feel like they are comfortable enough in that industry, that's probably a red flag as well.
I actually mean, what are some of the red flags for the companies? As a designer, if I'm like, say, like, I look for a job, and what are some of the this is from a designer's perspective, how would I judge, like, this is a company I might want to avoid, especially for designers who are early in their design career, who are often like taken advantage of.
There are so many red flags. I don't even know where to start. That's why I'm kind of struggling with this. I would say maybe one major one is, or one question you can ask is like, how much advocacy is there for UX on the team right now? Because there's this concept called fighting for your lunch, right? Which is when you join a team and it's like engineering-led, product-led, whatever, it could be really hard to get your voice in there as like a UX designer. And asking a question of like, how much advocacy is there? How much of an appetite is there for UX is a really great way to get that major red flag out of the way. But in terms of other red flags, it's just there's a lot. But I'll start with that one. That's probably the biggest one, I would say.
Yeah, I agree on that. And like, I think that there's also a good question to ask is ask what they think design is, because I guess like a lot of the time there is potentially a misunderstanding that design is mainly about, you know, like executing requests or like making mocks or like making prototypes. But design as its root, I think as Henry mentioned about what user experience is really about solving problems. And like, you know, that's why we potentially need design very early in the process to kind of go through that discovery and definition phase of like, what is the product that we're actually trying to build? What is the problem that we're actually trying to solve? So really ask that question of like, how, like say like, how does, you know, the company leaders work with designers? How does the PM work with the designers? How does the engineer work with the designer? Like you can really understand what they understand as design in that organization.
There's actually a really great article from the Newson Norman group. I think it's on like the 8 stages or 8 levels of UX maturity. I highly recommend checking that out. I think something like level 1 UX maturity is like, never heard of UX before, kind of want to get into it because it's kind of a buzzword now, so let's hire one. Level 8 maturity is like, let's bring UX in super early. So for example, I mean, I'll be honest, I don't think HubSpot is level 8. We would love to be. We probably are level 8 in some teams and not others. But I can tell you on my team, UX is very much as a part of the overall strategy. So we own the pricing and packaging for HubSpot in terms of how do we go to market. And our UX researcher is right there with the rest of our stakeholders in terms of research. So we have projects and initiatives that are led by UX. And I think if you can try to center your questions to figure out the maturity level of that organization, that's going to help you get a lot of red flags out of the way. I mean, at the same time, you can also join an organization that's low maturity level. If you like fighting for your lunch and that's your jam, by all means, go for it. That's not a red flag or anything either, if that's your, you know, bread and butter.
Yeah. No, and I want to just to add to that, I think that 2 things is one, especially when as a designer, you can be selfish, right? Because it's such a high demand profession currently. So what are the, like, does this company's mission and vision makes you tick? Are you excited about that? And then are they going to help you learn and advance in whatever it is that you want to advance? So even if there's no maturity, can you build it? Is it something that you can kind of like, are you the next, you know, head of design for this organization? And so I think that there's something about really being driven by that mission of the organization and the leadership and the opportunity to grow and develop in your career that can help get there. So I think that you know, as founders, this is the struggle that we all have, where there's so much opportunities for folks to go anywhere. What makes you different? Like, how are you gonna keep that talent in?
I'm sorry to all the startup founders out here, but if you're a designer, ask the question: when was the last time you paid another designer more money? Go get your paper. You know, like designers are in like so hot right now. So yeah, go secure that job. Shop around.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, so this is our discussion, and I think next we can go into the Q&A. And for those who are joining virtual, feel free to send your questions in the channel.
Do we have any questions in the room that we want to get to? Yeah, I see one hand up already. Oh, good afternoon, sir. What's your name?
Chris Shepard. Hi, just a real quick question. Just wanted to get your take on the Figma acquisition that happened last week.
Brilliant business strategy. Terrible for users. Let me explain. So if you are Adobe and you're thinking a lot about your customer base, you can see that you already lost a lot of users to Sketch throughout the last couple of years. I think there's like some studies that said that like most enterprise designers are split between Sketch and Photoshop. This was like 4 years ago. And now Figma's taking over because they have a lot of features and functionality that allows teams to actually design as a team, as a unit, collaboration, especially now that we're in a remote world. So I think if you're Adobe, great move. Probably paid a little too much in my opinion. But I think if you're a user, this is probably where it gets kind of a little tricky, right? Because now you probably have to deal with Adobe all over again. So there's probably some concerns there. But I did see an article saying that the CEO of Adobe said that they're going to let Figma operate on its own as its own entity. So I think there's some hope there. So that's not a bad thing. But I mean, I think in a capitalistic world, Figma was eventually going to raise their prices anyways, which is one of the reasons why I think people are so pissed off about Adobe, because how expensive it is. But if you look at the amount of users Figma has and the amount of revenue they're generating, there's a huge gap there. So eventually they're going to find pricing axes and levers in order to pull to actually monetize even more. That's a whole separate conversation I can have for another time though. So
Thank you for that. We have one more question here. Sir, what's your name?
Martin. I had a question that focuses more on the research side of UX. How important do you think it is to have study design and study hygiene as a part of the process that you deal with when you're constructing your UX teams?
I'll take it again. I'm so sorry. I would say it's really important. Here's the reason why. There's a really famous saying that you can tell and squeeze the data to tell you whatever you want. And that's the reason why you need to have really great hygiene, right? I think if you are a company that is entering different segmentations, it's really important to actually do your research and have really important methodology to attack different segmentation, so you can understand your customer profile a little bit better across different segmentations, which is really important. So for example, we are a global company and the buying behavior of someone in, let's say, Germany versus someone in like Singapore versus someone in Japan, very different, right? The way that they operate, the tools they use, the whole process itself is really different. So it's really important to actually have not only a wide breadth of methodology, but then at the same time, you need to actually have really great analysts that can actually take that data and give you an interpretation of the data that is the least amount of bias as possible. Because even today, we still have teams where we will bend the data in order to tell you what you want to hear. And that can get really dangerous. So hygiene is extremely critical and really important. And it's actually one of the reasons why when you get to a certain size and you have a certain amount of UX researchers, you need to bring in a UX research leader who is extremely well versed with a lot of those methodologies and how to actually analyze that data. That's not me, but I'm just saying you definitely need someone who's really critical in being able to do that, because I can certainly, I know enough about data to be dangerous to bend that data sometimes myself. So you have to be really careful there for sure.
Great question, great answer. So before we transition to the virtual questions, do we have any questions left in the room? Looks like we're good. All right, let's hit on those virtual questions.
We actually don't have any virtual questions, but I think based on everyone, what everyone talks about earlier, we do have a few follow-up questions.
I think if there's a question about books, is this a book suggestion specifically for be more specific, like just like general book suggestion? I'll tell you what, I'll give you 2 book suggestions for accessibility. How's that? And I don't know if this is hitting it, but 2 for accessibility. One is, I don't know if you heard about Kat Holmes. Anyone in the audience? Probably. She wrote this book called The Mismatch. If you can see my video, this book looks like this. You can't see it. But it's just a really good book that I bought our designers in our organization about how inclusion shape design. So for an introductory, kind of like for product design, inclusion, and accessibility, this is a good one. And then the second book is called Inclusive Design for the Digital World. And I can add it on, I can kind of like follow up with the information. But any information about how it is a designer or co-founder, I can start thinking about inclusion for accessibility. These 2 will be my go-to, and I'll post it right now on chat as well, so you have it.
Thank you, Tamar.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, another
So-
question. Do you have any tips on usability testing for accessibility with limited resources? Does anyone else want to take this one on the panel before I do?
I kind of alluded to this earlier. There's a bunch of Chrome extensions, honestly, out there that are free to use. The exact name is escaping me on the one. It's WCAG, and I believe it's checker, 2 words. And basically, you put that Chrome extension on. You can go to your website, any website, frankly, and you can get a instantaneous report on the errors for usability, for accessibility, any warnings. So errors are definite red flags that you need to correct. Warnings are suggestions. Errors for these kinds of tools, include things like alt text missing on images. In addition, contrast issues. If you have colors that are overlapping that don't have the right contrast ratio so that you can, legibly read it. These are the things that these free tools surface. So that's a really quick and easy way to get a high level report on what's working and what's not on your website or web app.
And just to add to this, just really super quick. So Figma have really fun plugins that you can add. So Figma have a lot of plugins. I wrote down X by DQ. Same thing like was mentioned here. You have those plugins you can add. I will though say that all those tools that are automated, that can be automated and sniff, can only detect between 25 to 30% of accessibility issues. Why? Because they can only detect the issues that can be sniffed by a code. So does it have an alt text, yes or no? The color contrast. However, currently more than those are more of the behavior, and these cannot be detected by plugins. And so this doesn't come instead of an actual person who uses assistive technology on the day-to-day that can give you that feedback. So it's definitely really good for those low-hanging fruit that you want to remove, especially at the beginning of the development life cycle for sure. But it doesn't replace the, someone who have that lived experience, if you will, of someone with a disability, visible or invisible, that can really give you feedback. In terms of kind of like reaching out, there are organizations that partner and provide service of doing audits or reviewing designs, or you can reach out to, there are community like the Community for the Blind have a lot of resources and they can do testing. Please do pay them. Don't, like a lot of people like, can you do it for free? No, please do pay them. And then the other thing is, I don't know if in those small organizations or maybe startups have ERG groups. If you have any, these are really good free resources of your employees. 1 in every 5 or 6 of us have some kind of disability, visible or invisible. So how can you tap into your organization, like your employees, to provide that feedback as well? Could be also a really good resource.
Speaking strictly for digital product design, I would say good artists copy, great artists steal. So go to a lot of like the Apple websites, Google, even HubSpot, Canvas, Shopify, Spotify, and check out and just type in the brand name and then type in design system. And usually you land on their public page around their design componentization library. And often enough, especially a company like Apple or like Google, a lot of this stuff does pass a lot of accessibility tests. So you can always just borrow or steal a lot of the components that already exist, especially for some of the more complex one, like data visualization. Like books have been written around that, but you can also just borrow a lot of those elements as well too, just to start if you are limited on resources.
Yeah, and on that note, to reiterate a point that I think Tamara made earlier, make sure to, like work closely with your engineers as well. Like there are established guidelines, not just on the design side, but also on the development side, like ARIA labeling, like, what is the best way to like label text so that like, people with a blind or low vision disabilities can use it better. And in terms of like working with like partners or like other organizations locally that have expertise in accessibility. For example, at Motional, we work with the IHCD, which is the Institute for Human-Centered Design, and they have like a whole team that is focused on like designing for accessibility, and they also have what they call user experts who are all the disability communities that they can help bring in instead of you having to go out and search for them yourself.
Thank you. And we do have an earlier question from Jeremy. Jeremy said, as a startup with less than 20 employees with a product that has a consumer-facing and a business-facing product, both with very different accessibility requirements, are there any tips to automate these standards with drastically different requirements?
Both is hard. So for any, like coming from a very regulatory standpoint, what you want to abide by, or most organizations have adopted, are the requirements around that are called WCAG 2.1 level AA, which means there are 53 different criteria that companies would need to meet in order for you to be able to sell that product to those really high regulated federal institutions, banks, hospitals, whatever it might be. They would require you to meet those standards. Again, in order for you to meet the standards, you need to do two things. One is automate, and I just posted, like DQ have a really cool tool, free plugin for designers and developers that you can plug in. Google have the Lighthouse as well. So there are those kind of like free tools that you can add in terms of automating. These would test the 30%. In order for you to meet the full requirements, you would need to do an audit. And in order for you to do an audit, it's either you have someone in your organization who is an accessibility SME that can test towards those standard requirements, or you give it to a third-party vendor, and that third-party vendor is doing those audits for you. At the end of the day, what you need to submit is a document called a VPAT, which stands for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, which is really funny because it's not voluntary because you want to sell it to federal. But anyways, this document pretty much outline how accessible the product is compared to those federal, WCAG requirements, the word content accessibility requirements, and they would want to see that you meet all of those. Now, the follow-up question might be, well, how strict are they, right? So for example, I worked with the IRS and some other organization. It really depends on your stakeholders. Some of them don't really care if you're meeting those requirements. They just want to have this VPAT document and you're good to go. Some of them will be really, really strict, and they're not going to be, don't want to do business, or they ask you to fix those issues before you go in and, kind of like get into contract with them. So, automated is part of the process. You need to make sure that you're auditing against WCAG 2.1 level AA currently in order for you to meet those really high requirements. If you do that, then you'll be able to sell not only in the United States, but it actually covers you globally as well, because it has like Section 508 and a lot of other stuff in it.
Yeah, and I think in terms of general the accessibility guidelines, that would be the same whether you're selling to a business or to a consumer, because that's speaking more to inclusive design. But it sounds like also your question's getting at a little bit higher level than just accessibility design, but also usability and navigating the different requirements between your business customers and your consumers. And I think for your business customers, like I mentioned earlier, a customer advisory board is not an automated way of necessarily gathering that feedback, but it is a good way to bootstrap kind of the feedback in the earliest days, especially when you're a company of that size. And then on the consumer side, you can use products like Hotjar and other methods to understand and get aggregate data on how are people actually interacting with your product. So
Great, thank you. And we have about 3 minutes left, and we have one last question in the chat, which is, there are a lot of advice has addressed the visual design or usability. Are there any additional tips you'd offer to content designers who may lean more on writing text than visual elements?
So at HubSpot, we actually have a whole UX specialization role called content design. This person who's asking a question, they sound a lot like they can fit into this role. I've seen other companies call this role a UX writer. A lot of content designers and UX writers typically fall into the skill set of around information architecture, making sure that they understand overall customer journey flows, understanding that there is comprehension and consistency with language and content visualization across the entire spectrum. And also they are often huge accessibility experts as well too, in terms of making sure that the text and language and the content is accessible across different languages, especially if you're a global company. So I would look into content design and UX writer as a role for whoever's asking this question.
Yeah, oh, go ahead.
Or you could go first.
So just to add, again, coming from an accessibility standpoint, we all have a role to play, right? So designers have their things, or UX have things that they need to think about. Developers have things to think about, and content, from a content standpoint, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done for content creators. And it's not only that visual, it's also like links and buttons and tables and multimedia. And especially for now, there's like this new field under accessibility, which is cognitive, right? So for people who are we're not getting younger and are kind of like our processing is getting slower. And so how do we make sure that all the content that we're creating is simplified, cohesive, not too much? There's a lot of movements around neurodiversity, and people are on the autism spectrum that are looking for kind of like, very generalizing right now, but like predictability, consistency. And so this is all the work of kind of like that content side. So a lot of responsibility from that side as well. Like how do we add descriptions for label, descriptions for text, structure of the page, and all that stuff Henry was just talking about.
Yeah, and to just add on to all of those as well, I'm not a copywriter by any means, but one of the learnings that we just recently learned is that we want our content to have clarity over brevity. And that's one of the key things that we've been trying to adhere to, because a lot of the time you would have requests from people to say that, oh, like, can you make it shorter? Because like people don't have attention to like read this much text, but like we read every day. And then like, I think like at the end of the day, like it's better to have something that is clear over something that is too brief, that people have to like look again and like, be confused at the end of it.
Great suggestions, everyone. So I think we're just at a time where we can wrap up this session. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, all the panel speakers today for offering your suggestions. And thank you for all the audience who are attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.